Evening and welcome to the very last of our Ask the Farmer Q&A sessions for this season. My name is Brigid and I run the Farming for Nature initiative, and I'm joined tonight with my co-host Brendan Dunford, who's a volunteer with the Farming for Nature project, and also his day job is running the Burren programme in County Clare. So Farming for Nature was set up in order to encourage and inspire farmers across Ireland to incorporate more nature on their farm where possible. And one of the ways we do this is each year we find exemplary farmers that are doing great work working alongside nature. And these are our Farming for Nature ambassadors. And this Ask the Farmer session is a way of working with these ambassadors and asking them questions and finding out about their farming practices. So over the next hour, myself and my colleague Brendan will kickstart the session with asking our guest speakers some questions. And then in the chat box on your banner, feel free to ask any questions you have about their farming practices, especially around farming for nature. And we'll get around to facilitating as many of these questions as possible. If you miss any of the previous sessions or you miss some of tonight's session, it should be up on our YouTube channel by tomorrow afternoon. So feel free to look it up there and spread the word about these Ask the Farmer Q&A sessions. So on to tonight's session, we are delighted to have Tipperary farmer Mimi Crawford join us. And Mimi and her partner Owen run a 28-acre organic farm near Cloughjordan in County Tipperary, in North Tipperary. It's a mixed up farm, but using many traditional methods and ultimately looking at producing healthy produce, healthy animals, healthy soil and healthy pastures. They have a micro dairy, they have shorthorn cattle for beef production, pigs, broilers and ducks, and they their whole ethos is the more diverse the system should be, as diverse as the nature on the farm, and producing a very kind of healthy farm. Mimi, welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight. So Mimi, you might just start with telling us a bit about your own journey into agriculture and onto the farm that you are on now.
By no means a traditional farmer or grew up in a traditional farming background. I would say where I'm from in the States, my parents had a couple hundred acres, but it was mostly sort of hardwood forestry, do things like make maple syrup. We had a few chickens, horses. It was more of a homesteading type lifestyle. And I suppose that's kind of the approach a little bit that we took toward farming, just on a slightly bigger scale, extending to more of a farmstead scale. But my actual training is in physics and geophysics and geology. But I became a bum after school, and I actually traveled to several different countries doing woofing, which, if anybody doesn't know, it's worldwide opportunities on organic farms. So essentially you travel around to different places, you volunteer your time on that farm for hopefully an exchange of knowledge from that farmer, growing vegetables, milking cows, whatever they're doing. So I did that for about a year in New Zealand. That's how I came to Ireland originally and met my dear husband. But I learned a lot that way in areas in farming that I wasn't familiar with, but never really was on a big intensive farm or a conventional farm. Usually those woofing farms are a bit smaller. I did milk for a summer on a friend of ours had an organic dairy in the States. But then when I met Owen and we ended up taking over the farm here, we inherited it from his mother. We were very lucky in that sense. Still very grateful. I know that not everybody has that opportunity, but we sort of, I think we were reluctant farmers. I mean, Owen's background is in furniture design and production, so we kind of wanted to produce food for ourselves mainly. But then there was local demand, and then there was extended demand, and more and more people wanted sort of the same thing that we did, and so it sort of grew organically from there. So now we're both farming full time. When we started out, I was still working in consulting and things, but yeah, so that's where we are today.
Brilliant. You might just explain to us your farming system, what your farm looks like, what the system is, and how it's run, kind of season to season, or
Yeah, so we're pretty much completely seasonal. So we do production, sort of for 9 months of the year. So we do have the micro dairy, as you mentioned, and the enterprises kind of evolve around that. We try to take a holistic approach to them. But we have 12 Irish shorthorn cows that we milk, and from that we produce and sell raw milk, cream, butter, buttermilk, sort of all the old-fashioned things. Skim milk we do not sell, but we do fatten pigs on skim milk. So there are waste recyclers of that stream of waste for us. We so and they in our pig system has evolved through the years. We had static paddocks for them originally. We've gone to something a bit different, which are similar to our chicken tractors, where we're calling it a pig tractor. So in this trying to whole mimic nature with our species, sort of pigs are naturally woodland creatures, and we're not. We don't have any woodland on the farm. We're very small, and so it's kind of a balance for us. But Owen designed this movable pen in-house for them that he can hook onto the loader, and it moves up and down the hedgerows essentially. So we don't bring in a tractor to cut our hedgerows, but the pigs do a good job of trimming them back as they go along. So they get moved every day then to fresh pasture and move along that way, recycle the milk, produce us with great food, which is all part of the cycle. Chickens are the same, so they filled into our rotation sort of behind the cows. The idea is the cows graze a pasture down, wait about 3 days usually within 3 days. If you have any beneficial dung beetles, things like that, they will have done their work within the cow pats, and then you run along with your section of what we are chicken tractors. Now we do not pull them with a tractor. They're called tractors because they do quote unquote work. So what we're trying to do in mimicking nature with all the different species is trying to harness what job they would naturally do in nature. And so the chickens come along after the cows, and they do a little sort of light harrowing almost. They do a little tilling, they scratch through the cow pats, they eat any of the fly larvae, so it's part of a clean grazing system. They get the nutritious green sprouts that have come up after that, and then they move on. So it's a daily into new pasture. So it's a managed impact. There are little sort of nitrogen fertilizer tractors as well, and then they move on. So we can cover, one of our bigger fields each year with our sort of 5 batches of broilers that we do that way. So we try to just look at the synergies between things and how the operations fit together, and how they can be sort of mutually beneficial to each other. The same as with the ducks. We do about 1 batch of ducks a year. They're great for slug control. We just let them roam free. We're not as we don't have quite the time to do every operation and move every single day to new pasture sort of thing. So we just let the ducks run as much as they want. And so they'll cover probably about a quarter to a third of the farm, doing their slug control in the time that they're here. And they have their little pond and things like that, and then they go off. So that's basically it. And that's the food production side of it. We usually have one field that we do in tillage, nothing like your illustrious guest last week. We buy grain off Tom instead of, but because we aren't the best grain growers in the world, but we do it for straw primarily. We have a heritage variety of oats, and it's so nice and handy on a small farm to have small square bales, that sort of thing. So we do have some of the oats that we do feed to the chickens and things. We do try to grow the feed as much as possible, but primarily for the straw as well.
Are your cattle outside all year round? Is it 12 months?
It depends. So no, they're not. We're not efficient stockpiles of grazing and things like that to have them grazing outside all year. We do let them out in the winter if the weather is nice, but that's usually onto one of the fields that's in tillage, and then it's bale grazing on that field usually. It's great to get organic matter onto those fields to get some impact, but we don't usually let them out into pasture during the winter. We do have housing for them. Yeah.
So you have a really diverse mixed system, obviously, and I mean, some people might look at that and go, God, is that very labor intensive? Or do you, because obviously you have to have diverse markets as well. Do you find it's quite widely spread in terms of your time, or does it all just fold into each other anyway, and your customer base and your market base and also the work on the farm,
Yeah, I mean, so I'll touch the work on the farm part first. Everyone says that, and what I always say is things like, okay, so the chicken tractors, so we do them usually in batches about 200 to 250 at a time. So that's 5 chicken tractors that you're moving. Takes maybe 40 minutes in the morning to do it once, during the day. I would rather be outside in fresh air doing that for 40 minutes every day than have to clean out a big massive chicken house after those chickens have left. So it's a different. It's work, but it's a different type of work. It's just spread a bit differently. there are some more things that are hands-on. There's a lot more things that are hands-on in the actual food production part of it. So for the dairy and butter, and butter's a lot of work, a lot of work to make. That's why no one does it anymore.
Are you learning the hard
But
way?
I know. Learning the hard way. It's lovely though. I've had a hard time stop doing it because we like it too much.
Yeah.
But it's not necessarily more hands-on work on the farm. Do you know what I mean? It's maybe more actual physical work than it is like tractor work and that sort of way. But time-wise, no difference. When it comes to market streams and retailers and those sort of things, really when we started out, the dairy was the main thing and the meat was just ancillary, and it still kind of is. It's a support operation. It definitely has grown. But what you find, or what we have found, is that once you get a customer buying one thing and they like that one thing, they want everything that you produce. They don't just want that one thing. Unless maybe they're vegetarian and they just want the dairy, they're not interested in the meat, that sort of way. But if they're not, then they want the pork, they want the chicken, they want the beef, they want everything that you produce. And so that's what actually has made the farm more financially viable, is that diversity of income streams, both from individual people and then from retailers as well. Because we don't sell actually through retail, we don't sell much meat. It's mostly dairy. Most of the meat is all direct sale.
Okay, so people come to your farm, they've ordered online, something like that, is it?
Yeah, we have local delivery rounds. We are at the milk market in Limerick every Saturday during our 9-month season. We meet people, like when we're doing deliveries for our dairy to retailers, we have drop points for people where they can collect, that sort of way. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So I really like, you were just talking there, I don't know if circular economy is the right word, but do you know that kind of rotational of the poultry following the cattle, and or the kind of ducks eating the slugs, and the pigs, and like, where did you get these ideas? Did you learn from other people? Have you found it out through experience? Or I mean, there's kind of some unusual ideas there. Maybe you explain some of these different ideas and then how you found them. Or
I mean, some of them come from in the States a little bit. Joel Salatin is a big one who did chicken tractors. There's people in Europe now. Richard Perkins is doing a similar thing. I think the difference a little bit, as you find, is that most people on our size of scale are also doing a market garden of some nature. We are just trying to focus on the animal production side of things. I suppose what it comes more from is permaculture and sort of scaling the ideas of like stacking functions within permaculture. It's kind of a mesh of that, and then sort of biomimicry and looking at the beneficial relationship between grazing herds of herbivores who were followed behind, the birds follow behind them, do you know what I mean, and peck through all of the dung. Like that's just it's a natural evolutionary process. And so it's looking at just kind of taking a step back, I suppose, and saying, if we weren't in this, how would these animals sort of fit together in any way, shape, or form? And best trying to mimic that as we can, with the total realization that it is a bit of a contrived system. But yeah, so that's the goal, really. I suppose that's where it comes from. It's no one specific system. It's kind of a mesh of a million different ideas, and they're not always right. So we change something every year. We learn as we go too.
yeah, because I was interested to see, like, you have 1,000 broilers or whatever. Like, do you get to a point where you kind of go, right, we've got enough stock to, you've only got a certain amount of land, like you said, so to work with and stuff. So do you feel like you're now at your optimum in terms of your balance?
Yeah, so I'd say we're walking a bit of a knife edge usually. Everything is a bit of a compromise. We would like a tiny bit more land just to be as a bit of a buffer for feed and things for winter, for fodder for winter. If we have a really dry winter and we can't produce enough, then we're buying in. And we could take all the grain out completely and not have any straw, and then have to buy in straw. So there's always a balance. There's always a sort of a compromise. So we would like to have a tiny bit more. Where we are now, we would like to have a tiny bit more, I suppose, rather than scale down the operations, just because they're financially viable as they are at this scale. We don't need to get any bigger. We don't necessarily want to get any bigger. We would just like that little bit of a buffer a bit more.
Yeah, fair enough. So just onto the nature side of things, like, what have you done in your farm deliberately for nature, or continue to do, or on your farm for nature?
Yeah, so we try to plant a lot of trees as much as we can within the 28 acres. So we plant little sort of coppices within grain fields. little step outs from all of the fences. We have one field that's lovingly dubbed the rock field because all the rocks are at surface. So we've planted and fenced trees at each of the rocks because you can't get a piece of machinery in there, so you may as well make it into a sort of an agroforestry field. That's a big one. Trees and hedges. We don't cut our hedges. We haven't cut them. They haven't been cut on this farm for about 8 or 9 years. We cut back the briars by hand on a few of them every winter. But that's just to be able to not have them encroach too much. Now, if we can run the pig tractor on them, they will do that work for us. So cut that down. Minding the way that we graze and the impact that we have and how that affects the soil, that's a big one for me and for us, sort of coming from a geological and sort of background. Managing that impact as best we can by having, concentrated sort of mob grazing-ish type impact with cows, moving them on, chickens, moving them on, allowing for a long rest period. It allows for things like wildflowers to come back into your pastures. You get higher density covers. You get, the vermin that the raptors can then come in and eat because there's cover for them. So the little things like that can make a massive difference to the overall ecosystem.
Okay. Have you noticed a big difference since you've been there, in the kind of numbers or what's showing up? Or
I'd say I've noticed more in the last 2 years. I mean, so technically this is our sort of 6th year of production, so we're not massively far into this. When I was working off farm, I don't know whether it was just I was less observant when we first started because I was also working off farm and it was hard to slow your time, or now is when we're actually seeing the impact. But you notice a lot more the species diversity in the pastures just with doing nothing. So we don't really reseed pastures unless, for example, they've been in tillage and they need to come out of tillage. We had one that we reseeded with grass, but what we've sort of chosen to do in the past is sort of hand seed with the herb mixture sort of after that impact. So after the chicken tractors, if they've left little bare patches of ground, you scatter a few seeds as you go. It means you don't have to plow up an entire pasture. It's slow. It's definitely slow. But I think that's one of the lessons of nature is nothing is going to be immediate. So we have pastures that slowly, so things like chicory and plantain and sainfoin and lucerne, all those things are coming up in because we spread those as the chickens have gone around, as cows have gone around through cow pats, that sort of way. So definitely species diversity that way. I've seen a lot more of the fungal mycelium kind of spread out more from the hedges and more from the trees than it has in the past, partly because there's no artificial inputs going on to them, so we get nice flushes of edible mushrooms as well as non-edible mushrooms, but you can see those sort of extending a bit farther. Their reach every year is getting more and more into the pastures, which is amazing to see that fungal network. The bird species, I mean, definitely we see a lot different, even just walking down our lane. We're in a big sort of dairy tillage country. You can notice a difference on one side of the lane versus the other, just because you've let the hedges grow and you have the cover and you have the things that they're looking for, the berries and the food, and so yeah, those sort of things, definitely.
Yeah, great. I saw, today, obviously, they've opened up the organic scheme again for farmers, and you guys are certified organic. Do you see huge opportunities within the organic scheme? I mean, is it something that you think farmers should be encouraged to do, or has it provided opportunities for you guys?
I think that everyone should go organic, whether there's a scheme or not. The organic scheme is extremely, extremely good. I think they should put lots more money into it. I think that Ireland has potential to do a lot more, manage land, whether it's certified or not, a lot more in an organic manner. We actually, so funny story, we converted when there was no scheme. But because it was something that we believed in. Now, again, we had the luxury to do that because we didn't have massive facilities in place that we had to change. We didn't have a massive system in place. And I understand that that's the barrier for a lot of farmers who are getting into it, who already have a system in place. If you have all slats and you have to go put in, 3/4 dry bedding, that's a big infrastructural change. We were very lucky we didn't have that. So we could choose to do it there was no payments there, but we were going through conversion. We were selling directly to consumers who, if we told them we're going into conversion, this is what we're doing, and they knew us, that was its own sort of certification. I love that it's open. I think what frustrated me when we got into organics is because there wasn't a scheme there, the department actually rang me up and said, "You realize there's not a scheme there. Why are you converting?" And I thought, if that's the message that you're sending to people, do you know what I mean? Then what are we ever going to achieve? But it's definitely needed. More money is needed to encourage farmers to go that way for sure. Yeah. I'm glad that it's open. I know that I wish PIPA would get more money for it.
Okay, so and within your system, do you think there's financial benefits to being organic?
There is definitely. I think yeah, absolutely. I mean, you have to charge more because your feed costs more, these sort of things. I don't say you can charge more. It's not that you're trying to price gouge people. It's just you're trying to cover your costs, and which are definitely higher within organics. Absolutely. It's harder to source things, especially now with Brexit. Even a lot of our feed comes in through the UK, and people who are getting organic starter for broilers is proving very difficult. So there's a challenge there with that, and you have to have a price point to justify doing that. As Tom said last week, though, you can't, like, people who are looking for this type of food, they want it to be organic, they want it to be grass fed. So it's definitely, I wouldn't say as much that some of the retailers mind. You know what I mean? If they knew you, again, if you were selling all direct, 100% direct, and you didn't have any third party that you needed a certification through, then you wouldn't necessarily need to be certified. If we sold everything to Clock Jordan, and we could survive on that, then maybe we would need to, because they all know us. But once you go a little bit bigger, it's just that one bar to say, I know at least this producer has done X, Y, and Z, and somebody has confidence in that system. So
yeah, fair enough. I'll just ask you one more question before I hand over to Brendan. So, I mean, you guys have traveled far on this journey for the last, 6 years, as you said. Where have you looked for advice and support? Where have you found the best kind of sources of support about when you're looking for changes, when you're just so you can recommend to other farmers?
each other. Wait, I don't. Yeah, that's a good question. Other farmers definitely. I think part of the challenge for us starting out, we started out in raw milk again 6 years ago when no one was doing it, and so we are kind of building the mold for that. There was one other farmer, and then Dorina down in Ballymaloe. Do you know what I mean? But there's very other few to look forward to or look to now, and there's more and more farms in Ireland who are doing really cool things. So you look at, like, anybody who's in the Farming for Nature, you look at the biological farming conference that Knott's puts on, the conference in the UK, the Oxford Real Farming Conference. Somebody like Richard Perkins, who has similar mixed type strategy, was useful research for our farm because he's UK based. Usually my tendency is to look at people back in the States because that's where a lot of my influence came from. But everything is different there. The climate is different. It's not necessarily the best place to look. You can get an original idea, but what you find is you kind of pull bits and pieces of ideas from loads of different places, and then sort of build it into your own system. But definitely peer-to-peer is a big one, because just learning from like Tom last week of what works and what doesn't. Do you know what I mean? People have trialed things. We've trialed many different systems with pigs or chickens. Keeping foxes away from chickens. Foxes are great, part of nature, but they actually can destroy, a lot of our chickens in one go. So, learning from other people who have had similar experiences on the ground here, I think has been the biggest thing for us. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much expertise amongst farmers, and do you know what I mean? It's not just went to college, learned from a book. Farmers are on the ground learning every day something new. And
so much, I think that's what you learn with education, is it so much that you get taught when you actually get into that field, whatever that field is, whether it's farming or something else, is really not that applicable. You think, oh wow, you so much learning on the job per se.
Yeah.
I think that we're getting, like, better. Do you know what I mean? Like, Farming for Nature is only a few years old. These things are coming now. They weren't necessarily here 5 or 10 years ago. But I think there's a lot more opportunity now to learn from farmers sort of on the ground.
Brilliant. Listen, I'll hand you over to Brendan now. For anyone who wants to ask Mimi any questions, there's a chat box there on your banner. Just type them in and hopefully we'll get around to as many of them as possible. Mimi, thanks a million. I'll be back to you in a while.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Mimi. That was really interesting so far. And I was lucky enough to visit yourself and Owen last summer in between lockdowns. And it's just such a wonderful farm and two wonderful people managing it as well. So it was a real privilege and pleasure, and hopefully we'll get to repeat it this summer. One thing that I remember being really struck by was the hedgerows on the farm, which are astonishing. They're just stunning, both in terms of their scale and diversity. They really, really were memorable. And the thing that struck me at the time, the innovation, I still remember, is the pig tractor. Would you mind just describing what exactly a pig tractor is, what it looks like, and how it manages? Because I think it's a fascinating idea.
Yeah. Well, I'm lucky enough to have a husband who can build just about anything. So whether it's metal or wood, he can sort of do it. So it's his design. And what it is it's I don't know the exact dimensions of it now. He'd be better at telling you, but it's a pen in the front essentially that in a house in the back, and the house detaches, and the house can hook onto the front of our digger. And so you can shut the pigs in it and pick them up with a digger and move them to the next spot if you need to, and pull the pull the fenced bit behind it if you want. But in daily life, what they actually sit together, they hook together, and we have two barrels on the front that hold the skim milk that we pour in for them. And you go down in the morning with your buckets of skim milk, you pull the whole thing, pen and house, forward with the Jeep to a new set of grass along the hedgerow. And they walk right along with it. I mean, they're mad keen to get to the next set of grass as well. It's the same with the chickens. They know that like that fresh bit is coming. They turn it over really quickly. They get their milk and then they sleep for the night and move on the next day. It's hard to explain. I should have had pictures up for you, but if anyone comes on the walk, you can see it. It's not many people do it. It was a bit harder to find somebody that was doing that with a pig tractor type method more than the chicken tractors. But it's one of those things. It's a bit of a balance. The only thing I wouldn't be super keen on about it is it's big. The pen is big enough for them, definitely, but they don't have like miles to run, around in circles or anything. They just get really excited and run around in the same spot. But it's working. Yeah, it's working really well so far. Anyway, it's 1 year down. So this is, again, could be a learning experience next year.
It's like a chicken coop for pigs. What does the vegetation look like before and after? What's the impact of the pigs? I can imagine they root up the soil, but give it 3 or 4 months, Mimi. Does the vegetation look anything different? You get different species coming in, like nettles and stuff?
Well, similar to the chicken tractors, we can actually then sort of pick and choose what we want to seed behind them. So I just keep a rake and a bucket of sort of herbs and forbs, the sort of mixed 12 species, pasture mix down there. So after they move on, sprinkle some of that on, rake it out as best as possible. And then it's another way, again, to introduce different species into the pasture without having to plow up the pasture completely, because they'll make, you see like the self-heal and things sort of making their way into the pasture then, because then once the pigs have gone through it and it's regrown, it's grazed again by the cows and they spread things out. So we kind of pick and choose. It's a way for us. I mean, pigs are a natural sort of tillage animal. Do you know what I mean? If you could rent a pig out for rototill operations, I feel like it would be amazing. So they're a natural little tiller. And so for them to sort of turn over all the soil, it's a natural plowing and reseeding process for us, really, is what it is.
But you always keep them close to the hedgerow. You follow the hedgerow around the fields. Is how you.
Yeah, we do. Partly because they'll eat the briars and the nettles and anything that are in the hedgerow as well. And they sort of trim it back that way for us. Yeah, they just keep it from encroaching just a little too much.
Okay, well, a gold star for innovation, and Owen's got a career building those pig tractors if he wants, with his carpentry skills. A question I wanted to ask Mimi was about hygiene regulations. A lot of people are off-put by the whole notion of raw milk by virtue of the fact that they're worried that the Department of Ag or whoever will be down on top of them. Have you had much difficulty in that front?
Yes and no. I mean, we get inspected a lot. So we get inspected 4 times a year. We had our initial inspections of facilities and things like that The only reason I don't think it was probably as hard for us as it is maybe somebody who's starting now is that we started at a time when there wasn't raw milk regulation within Ireland. So cream and butter were regulated, and we were doing those. So we were always regulated, but the raw milk regulation itself wasn't in place until 2018. And so it was a bit easier because we were almost sort of shoot in just underneath that because we had already been inspected. Do you know what I mean? Similar to a cheesemaker or something like that. We were already getting those inspections. So it wasn't any more onerous for us when that came in. Also, we were one of the very few doing it at the start. And so while we had, a lot of inspections, our inspector, I think it can depend on who your inspector is as well. And again, it can be hit or miss, but I think it's been hard. It's probably harder now to start up, I would think, than it was at the time that we did. Yes.
Did you have to invest in a lot of kit?
We did things slowly. Because we started with 4 cows, I think people are a bit put off sometimes because they think they have to spend millions to put in like the fanciest milking parlor and the everything new and shiny. You do have to have really strict hygiene standards, but we still milk the cows in the 4-unit parlor where Owen's grandfather would have hand milked cows. It's plastered, you can power wash it down. As long as you can clean things, as long as you have a process and you follow the process and you show that the process meets the end goals of hygiene, then that's what matters, really. You don't have to have everything brand spanking new. We did have to invest in the dairy processing room side of things. So, a milk tank and a fridge. But again, we started with 4 cows. We actually didn't even start with a milk tank. We started with an old immersion cooler that would go into the churn and cool it really quickly. So there was some old technology there we could still, capitalize on. So it depends, it depends on how big you want to be, how much you want to do. Since then we have, we've invested in a bigger butter churn and a bit, slowly. So it hasn't been unmanageable by any stretch. But again, as long as your dairy processing room, as long as it's, washable and, things are stainless and that it doesn't have to be, you can get secondhand stainless steel tables. You don't have to have everything brand new or it wasn't as much as an expense as some people seem to think it has to be to get started anyway.
That's very positive. I think a positive message. How do you actually milk them? Is it because I think you're milking 12 at the moment? Is it using these independent clusters, or I assume we don't have a rotary milking parlor just yet? But
no, we just have the bucket milker. It milks 2 cows at a time. So okay. There's 4 of them in the parlor. He milks 2 at a time, 2 in, 2 out, sort of way with the bucket milker. Yeah, fantastic. And then the churns get dumped into the milk tank. So.
And I noticed at the time as well, you've got really nice marketing. I think your brand is it Crawford's milk, but you've got the glass bottles and all that kind of stuff. Was that a deliberate decision to kind of, was that part of the brand, or how did you go developing the brand and the affiliations around it?
Yeah, again, it kind of just all evolved from what we would want ourselves. That's probably a horrible marketing strategy for most businesses. Don't think about what you want and then assume everyone else wants that. But we thought if we're getting raw milk and this really high quality product, why would you want to put it in a plastic bottle? And we were very conscious of our environmental impact, and so we wanted returnable bottles, not just once-off use for glass, because really from a life cycle standpoint, that's almost just as bad as plastic a lot of the time. So we went down the path of trying to find somebody who would print labels, permanent labels onto glass bottles, and how we could get those back, and what the deposit system, how that would work. It's things that people used to do all the time, and we're sort of second nature. But what we found is that it works for some places, and we have a split probably now where it's about 60% glass, 40% plastic. But for some of the retailers, it's still the returnable part of the glass system still is a bit tricky. And we may get there, so again, slowly but surely. But yeah, so we just kind of thought about what we wanted and worked from there.
And I remember we had Doreen Ellen chatting before about, and we were asking her if she was starting again, what would she do? And she kept talking about raw milk is where it's at, and there's a huge demand. Are you finding there is a demand, and are you able to meet it, or do you think there's a demand beyond which you're not meeting at the minute?
Oh, I definitely think there's a demand beyond which we are not meeting. I think, I mean, raw milk is definitely, I think, more suited to smaller type operations, maybe not necessarily micro dairies, but people who, are milking an enormous amount of cows and can have a subset of them, beef or raw milk. But I think there's scope for, smaller producers like that in multiple locations throughout the country. I mean, we by no means with 12 cows are going to meet all of the demand. We get queries from Waterford and Wexford and places that we're not ever going to go. So if we weren't doing cream and butter and products and we were just pushing 100% raw milk, we would need to expand our network a bit more to just because I think probably with our retailers and the what we have right now, we've probably saturated the raw milk part of it. But since we're also doing the cream and the butter buttermilk, those are again additions. If we wanted to do none of those and all raw milk, we'd probably have to go a bit farther afield. But I definitely think there's scope for other producers. Yeah, absolutely.
And Mimi, I was going to ask as well, you've got a background, I think, in soil science, or you know quite a lot about it. Would you like to talk a little bit about the soil health on your farm? Because it's, of all the speakers we've had on these sessions on Mondays, the common denominator seems to be soil health and looking after the soil. What's your sort of take on that, and what do you do, and do you monitor the soil yourself on a regular basis?
Yeah, I suppose starting out, we again monitored more sort of the chemistry as most people do. I was a bit different in that I actually sent soil samples off to the States because I wasn't not keen on any of the labs here. And what they tended to give you back was NPK and what you need to do, and that if you're looking at other, like the actual health of the soil, then getting recommendations for fertilizer or lime requirements really for us wasn't enough. So we sent them back to a lab in Ohio to get sort of a full suite of all the trace elements of everything. Just because the interactions between those elements can tell you a lot. And if you're not getting all that information, it's hard to have a complete picture of the chemistry side of it. And then you add in the biological side of it, which is a big part, I think, with all the farming for nature people for sure, is sort of realizing that yes, chemistry is one aspect of soil, and yes, the physical characteristics, you're gonna have a hard time overcoming those, but you can enhance the natural biological capacity of your soil to overcome a lot of those things in the other categories, to release minerals that are actually there but they're bound, to make your soil more loamy. So we do monitor. We don't. I was doing soil samples sort of every year to begin with, and I've sort of stopped and been using just a bit more of the qualitative rather than the quantitative, just to try to get a feel for things better. Because again, we're not traditional farmers, and you talk to somebody who's been doing it for 30 years, and they just have this feel for how things should be. Do you know what I mean? They know, and I think sometimes I had a tendency to focus too much on the quantitative part and then miss out on the actual what that related to in a qualitative sense when you're in the field and you're looking at the soil and you're digging up, sod, and you're looking for whatever it may be, structure or earthworms, what that actually feels like, and then what that looks like when it's coming through in the plants and the plant health, and the diversity of plants. And then what that looks like in your animals, when your animals are healthy or not, and whether you're having to supplement them or not. So it works its way all the way up. I think that's what I like about soil, focusing on soil, is it works its way all the way up to food that we consume. And you hear so many people now talking about the soil microbiome and the human microbiome and how they're sort of parallels for each other. And we're focusing on that a lot more, I think, which is good.
And according to those indicators, I mean, the plant life and the health of the animals, do you feel your soil is quite healthy now? Your system is delivering healthy soils?
I'd say it's getting better. I'd say some fields are better than others, because we're learning definitely in the process as well. And some of the fields, like, again, when we started out, we didn't necessarily say we didn't know what we were doing. Trial and error was a big part of it. And somebody else would probably be better than I and do more research to start out. But we plowed a bit too much some of the soils, do you know what I mean? And we had weed problems, and a weed is what you define as a weed is a different thing as well. We had one tillage field that I actually loved. It was just full of charlock, but wild mustard, and the bees loved it, but it was supposed to be a tillage field. It wasn't supposed to be a field of quote unquote weeds, so, but you learn something through each of those things. So some of our fields we didn't treat as well. I would say those still need a bit of work. Some of the others are better. Some of the ones we planted trees in, I think, are the best. I think the interaction between the different trees, bushes, pasture species, I think the interaction between all of those different levels of the sort of succession of plants actually make for the best fields that we have.
Just a couple more questions, and then we've a load of questions on the chat, Mimi. I know a lovely thing about your farm is you're close to Clough Jordan, and you have a kind of, I think, a strong social dimension to what you do in the sense that you have training courses, and you sometimes have groups onto the farm. When people do visit your farm, what kind of impression do they normally have, or what kind of response do you normally get to what you do from people? Is there any typical response that you've come across?
We usually get Brigid's response of like, isn't this a lot of work? That's usually the first thing that people ask. The typical response, I mean, we do things with permaculture students and things like that, and the response is usually very positive, and it's people looking to do something similar, or they're looking for inspiration. I think a lot of people are looking for inspiration for a quote unquote a small farm size for something that's not vegetables. And so that's what we get a lot of feedback on is, oh, I didn't know you could do something with animals on such a small parcel of land.
And that's really interesting, because the same thing struck me before. You're quite unique in that regard. Your focus is on for a small farm, your focus is on the animals, the pigs, the chickens, and the cows. The other question I wanted to ask was with regard to agri-environmental schemes. I know you're in the organic scheme, but do you avail of any like GLAS or historically REX or any of those?
We are in GLAS, yeah, for a couple things. We have a traditional hay meadow in GLAS. We have a low input permanent pasture, things that were existing anyway, like our one hay field we put in as a traditional hay field, and the one field with the rocks in it you can't put anything in anyway is a low input permanent pasture. So some of the low hanging fruit ones like that, we did a few things in GLAS, yeah.
So it kind of complements what you do. Okay, let's have some questions from the floor now. So we start off with obviously Brian wants to visit the farm, Brian Gartland. So hopefully this summer, Brian, there'll be a visit, and Dorian as well. Phoebe, about the hedgerows, as well as mammals and raptors, do your hedgerows successfully support insects and bees despite the disturbance from livestock?
Yeah, so the disturbance from livestock is really very minimal. I mean, it's maybe a few of the berries, things like that. But in the spectrum of things, it's very small. Like we have massive whitethorn and like wild plums, like damsons, lots of fruiting things, lots of elderberries, lots of things higher up that cows and even cows would never even reach, let alone pigs. So yeah, a massive amount of insects and bees as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I can attest to that. Dorian asks, it's about food sovereignty. Are there any gaps due to Brexit that could be filled by Irish producers or innovators? Is this an opportunity for us to create greater food sovereignty?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, the big one that is just from our farm example is animal feed. So protein crops for animals. Now, again, last week Tom was talking about feeding human. There's some validation to feeding humans with protein crops rather than feeding animals with protein crops. But as long as we're gonna eat protein crops that are animals, we need the feed for them. So as it stands, I mean, I'm almost positive that every chicken, be they a laying hen or a broiler, that someone isn't home growing a small bit of feed for, do you know what I mean, for their three hens in their house, comes from outside this country. It's manufactured in this country, comes in pieces, do you know what I mean, and then it's put together in pellets here. But there's a massive scope for feed. That's a massive thing that we're missing in organics, especially. So not necessarily outside of organics, but within organics, there's just not enough people doing organic farming to sort of have those synergies exist between all those different farms doing different stuff.
Interesting. I think that's a good point. Brian Walsh, do you build the chicken tractors yourselves, buy them in, and also do you slaughter your broilers or have it done externally?
We do build the chicken tractors. They're relatively cheap to build. That's part of the beauty of them, really, is that they're cheap and cheerful. You can do them with 2x4s and chicken wire and scrap metal, really. And I'll put up pictures of them somewhere, or you can come visit. They're pretty easy. Yeah, if you have even a little bit of skill and a screw gun, you can build them. We do not slaughter our chickens, no. It's something that we've looked into. I don't necessarily know that we'll ever go down that road, but we are very lucky. We have a small local abattoir about 20 minutes away, and he does all of our animals. So he does all our beef, he does all our pigs, he does all our chickens, he does all our ducks for us.
Oh, that's fantastic. I think small abattoirs locally are critically important now that there's so few left, unfortunately. Linda Gilson, Linda's asking a question about hedgerow management, the importance of hedgerows. Just describe again your management. Do you trim the sides other than the pigs? Do you do any other treatment to the sides of the hedges, trim them back on occasion, or is it all pig related management?
It was only 1 year of pig related so far. We will selectively, if pretty much the blackberries, if the blackberries are encroaching way too much, and they're encroaching into where we normally drive or something, we'll cut those back by hand. Usually enlisted my father and another woman who works on the farm to do a couple of hedgerows this year, where we just cut back briars essentially. There are a couple hedgerows we were talking about for next year that we want to try to traditionally either ourselves or get someone to actually properly lay, because they need a bit thickening up. They were sparse enough to begin with, and now that we've let them grow for just 8 years, they turned more into like scraggly trees with briars in between rather than a really dense sort of hedgerow. So other than doing things by hand, we don't do anything.
And what time of the year does your father and your neighbour trim back to brambles? Is that a kind of a late summer, autumn job?
No, we do it in the winter when we have time.
Okay.
And then so we would have finished up several weeks ago. We usually do them in January.
Okay, a couple of practical questions. Is somatic cell count an issue with your dairy enterprise?
We haven't found to be an issue, no. And we have some pretty old cows and things as well. I mean, you do have to monitor it. The only challenge was getting a lab to test for such a small herd of cows, because we aren't sending milk to a creamery or something like that. So we have an actual electronic on-farm tester as well as sending them off to a lab. But as being an issue from our cows, no.
Okay. By the way, why did you choose shorthorns for the herd? Mimi, was that deliberate, or was it just what you kind of inherited when you came there?
A little bit of both. It was a suggestion from somebody who was in the farming world who we knew and respected their opinion. But we are also looking, so we had a tiny bit of experience with with cows on this farm that were carry cows. And while they were lovely and produced lovely milk, the offspring for them wasn't very dual purpose. So if you wanted to get a bit of beef, or it was a bit tougher. So we definitely wanted something that was a bit traditional, a bit more heritage, hardy, robust, would fit into an organic system, calved easily. They're very docile, they're very friendly cows, and that's important in such a small system. But they also then are a bit more dual purpose. So, we can get a beef bull or we can get a dairy bull, depending on what we want from offspring for the next year, whether we want to raise a few beef animals, whether we want, replacement heifers. So they're not as specialized. They're kind of like us. They're just a bit more,
Yeah, they always had the name of being great dual purpose animals back in the day, the shorthorns. Good for both. Just splitting up onto the beef side of things there, how many animals you finished them at around what, 26, 30 months, and how many years would you go through?
Yeah, we do very, very little beef. I'd say we don't have a fraction of the demand that we could for beef, but we only do a couple animals a year because we simply don't have enough land to keep that many dairy cows and all the other things just within the nitrates, to be honest.
Okay.
So it's not that our pastures necessarily couldn't support them, but it's just that we would be over our limit.
And do you have a stock bull, Mimi, or is it all AI that you use?
No, we've never AI'd. We always use a bull.
And what kind of bull do you have?
At the minute we have a shorthorn. In the past we've had a shorthorn. We've also had a moiled. We did a moiled cross as well, from he came from a traditional milking herd up north. So yeah,
Okay.
have a bit of both.
And sorry for all the questions now, but with the pigs, then what kind of breeds and how many would you process annually for market?
Yeah, so with the breeds, we're kind of we could take whatever we can get because we don't have a boar and a sow, so we're buying them in from a couple other farmers. One of them, Sean O'Farrell, was a Farming for Nature advocate in the very, very beginning. Yeah, he's just down the road from us. So he sometimes has like a Duroc, large white sort of land race. They're spotted cross. They're all crossed, and we got them from him. And then Joe Menton is another organic farmer who keeps a sow. So they're always kind of a Duroc, large white-ish cross usually.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry, and we do about 20 a year.
What age would they be when they go to slaughter, for example?
Yeah, you're talking 7 months usually, 6-7 months.
Okay,
yeah.
so 20. That's quite a number. And same abattoir again that you use for that.
Yeah, he does all of our animals.
Right.
Yeah.
Brian wants to see a picture of the pig tractor. I think we'll probably find one somewhere. Brian, I think I have one myself somewhere, but they're amazing. Luke Cape, just a question there from Luke. Mimi, can you explain how nitrates might inform or limit your farming system? Nitrates. Can you explain how nitrates might inform or limit your farming system? You have to keep a record, I guess, of all the nitrates that are coming into your system, etc.
Yeah, well, it's just so it's just for the department. There's a calculation. They consider each cow to be X kg of nitrogen per hectare. In each, depending on their age, and each pig and each chicken, that they each have a value essentially. And so based on your acreage, you actually have to work out, just for them, it's just a numbers game really, of how much quote unquote nitrogen you're producing on that patch of ground each year. And you usually hear about it with much bigger farms than ours, to be honest.
Yeah.
You're talking big intensive dairy farms who get nitrates derogations because they're over their limit. It's 170 kg of nitrogen per hectare per year is what it was. It's actually changing, but yeah, so that's just a department numbers game really. We just have to make sure that we're close to it because they consider all of our different operations in it, of course.
Okay. And speaking of department regulations, just to mention as well, is land eligibility an issue for you? You probably well under the kind of 10% limit for land eligibility. Your land is ruled as being not grazable, not farmable. Have you any issues with that, with land eligibility in the department?
No, we don't. Part of ours is ANC, but other than that, no.
Okay. Just a couple more questions, then I'll hand back to Brigid. You're almost there, Mimi. Thanks for all the answers. You're fantastic.
Yeah.
From Lena O'Regan, how do you find the large white cross for outdoor rearing? This is the pig.
Good, generally good. We actually had when we had them in static paddocks. I think they did worse because we didn't have. We were rotating the paddocks, but it was only 4. It was 4 paddocks, and they probably weren't getting enough rest time between that. Any buildup of whatever it might be for disease was working its way through the system. So we actually had more problems, I'd say, when we had static pastures. We didn't have any problems at all last year, and they were the same breed. They were just raised slightly differently. But in general, we don't have many health issues with them. Just maybe one pig a year. Before that, would have one thing, but nothing last year. Not
fantastic. And you have to keep them apart from the cattle. Lena also wants to know the cattle and the pigs. You have to keep them separate.
You don't have to, but you do by design, mainly because you don't want the cows grazing right after. It's both the pigs and the chickens. You wouldn't want the cattle coming back right after either of those, just because of the dung. So it's just part of the system to have a naturally long recovery. There would be they could get on fine, the cows and the pigs, but just as a nature of, we wouldn't necessarily want them in a paddock grazing right after the pigs had been there, just from sort of a disease dung perspective, really.
Just last question then for me before I go back to Brigid. So, you've been at this now, Mimi, yourself known for a good few years, and like you said, you learn as you go and you kind of build up knowledge as you go along. Are you happy with how things are going? Are you happy you made the decision to be kind of a mixed livestock farmer in the Midlands? And if you're talking to somebody who's starting a career in farming, thinking about beginning a career in farming, would you give them any advice based on your experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think because it's going well, it's easy to say, yes, it's wonderful. There's sometimes during the year, probably if you'd ask if we were super stressed and things weren't brilliant, you'd say, oh, geez, why am I doing this? But I think every farmer feels that way some days, depending on what's happening on the farm that day, that given day. But in general, absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's proven to be a rewarding way of life, as well as sort of a lifestyle and a job per se. But if you're I mean, people always you talk about the work and the job and things, but I say really it's our life. It's what we're doing. It's what we'd be doing as our life. It's a bit more intense. We wouldn't be raising that many birds for ourselves, but we'd be doing a little bit of it anyway. So why not do it and feed our community at the same time? So yes, it's wonderful. I'm glad that we're doing it. The funny part is I always swore I would never do something that is like dependent on nature or dependent on weather, because weather is so outside your control. But like farming in Ireland has to be the antithesis of something that's yeah. But what would I say to somebody else? What I'd say is think outside the box. There's a lot of stuff that's not being done. There's a lot of scope. There's more to farming than just beef or dairy or poultry or pigs, even for that matter. Do you know what I mean? Like there's rabbits and there's guineas and there's all these different things, if you're into animals or if you're into growing different things like Tom is or whatever it is, it's think outside the box. Do you know what I mean? If you're going to get into farming, there's a lot of, and think of what you're interested in too. Do something you're passionate about. And maybe isn't quite as mainstream, because it'll make it that much easier for you too if you want to market for things, or if you want to starting out it can be a bit tough, but it's that much easier if you're unique. So
yeah, great. Mimi, fantastic. I really enjoyed listening to you, and thanks so much for all the work that you do and for being with us tonight. So I'm going to go back over to Brigid for some wrap-up questions. Brigid.
Yeah, thanks, Mimi. Just one question I have actually, and you kind of touched on it with Brendan, but a lot of queries that we get from Farming for Nature is, oh, I'm scared that I'll lose my single farm payment if I start farming alongside nature a bit more. What advice would you give to farmers who say that?
I'd say two things. I mean, one is that what you find if you have the luxury, and it is a luxury sometimes to start farming for nature, to have that ability to say, I don't really care, about my single farm payment. Ours is tiny anyway, so if we lost it, it wouldn't be a big deal. So that is a luxury. I'll acknowledge that. But I think what you find is that once you do it, the financial reward from it is actually more than it would be if you weren't doing it. Do you know what I mean? We have to go through this financial door, but what you find is there's more rewards that come, and fewer inputs. Even if you're farming conventionally, if you start doing just small things that are farming alongside nature, you find that you have a little less overheads here and a little fewer inputs here, and in the end, actually financially it's benefiting you. And maybe that's not what you set out to do. Do you know what I mean? Maybe you thought it was going to be a big impact financially. I mean, I don't know why people think that they'll lose their single farm payment. I mean, single farm payment is area based. It is what it is. If you have land, you're going to get it, and you have entitlements on it, you're going to get it. And if you can do anything to make it a little bit more nature friendly, all the better.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned before, you walk down your avenue and you're kind of surrounded by intensive dairy and tillage. If you were to give one top tip to all conventional farmers in Ireland, what would your top tip be for incorporating a bit of nature on your farm? Where would you start if you were to give that?
I think the low-hanging fruit is the hedgerows. I mean, that's crazy. I mean, I know, and it's probably everyone says that, but I mean, the habitat, the ecosystem in Ireland is so fragmented in a lot of ways. Because we don't have big, massive swaths of forestry or woodlands anymore. We don't have, even just look at the area and number of national parks we have is tiny, compared to our land size. We have a lot of farms, but the hedgerows can be ecological corridors between the patches that are, ecosystem intact. And they can provide fodder and cover and all of those things if they don't get boxed cut all the time. So I think that's the easy. Plus, look, I mean, it's less time in the tractor, it's less, diesel, things like that. it's more time in front of the fire in the winter. You just let them grow for a year or two. I understand we need to cut them on roads, absolutely, for safety and things, but the ones, you know, internally, if we could just let those go a little bit, that would be amazing.
Yeah, especially now the nesting season has started. Listen, Mimi, thank you so much for your expertise, your knowledge, your generosity in sharing it. It's been a really lovely evening. And for anyone that's wondering, Mimi's actually doing, hopefully with kind of restrictions as they are, but Mimi's actually doing 2 walks for us this summer, one on the 11th of July and one on the 3rd of October. You can join the waiting list for this. So the bookings aren't open yet because we're waiting to see what the restrictions are, but there will still be probably limited numbers on these walks. So if you add your name to the waiting list on our homepage, www.farmingfornature.ie, you will then be notified when the bookings are open, and we'll open them up probably a month or a bit more before these walks. And so there's opportunity there to see Mimi's farm. Mimi also has a website. Mimi, what's your website?
It's crawfordsfarm.ie.
crawfordsfarm.ie. So if you're interested in looking at her produce and stuff, and you can, as we mentioned earlier, you can actually buy their produce anyway through, you know, if you've Duns and various other retailers, but the information on that would be on their website. This particular session will be up on YouTube hopefully by tomorrow afternoon. So, you know, do feel free to share that amongst your gang and your network. But also, if anyone's got any further questions for any of our ambassadors, we do have an online forum, which you can just ask questions about farming for nature practices, and this goes out also to our ambassadors, so they are able to answer through that. So, you know, just register online on our website to our forum, and you can just ask the questions. Mimi, you've been an absolute star. It's been a lovely end to our Farming for Nature Q&A session. We've been doing this since November. We did it last summer as well, and we did it from November now through to March. So you've been a great end to it all, because it's such a lovely, diverse farm you have, and it kind of covers a lot of areas. And, you know, you're a lovely spokesperson for nature. So thank you so much for all your time in joining us tonight. And just to say that hopefully, you know, we'll be back with this particular set of sessions probably next autumn and winter again. Would be the obvious time to restart them again. But thank you so much. Thanks for everyone for joining us for the last few months. Brendan, is there anything you'd like to add in there?
Just say thanks to Mimi and to all our speakers this year. I've found it a fascinating learning experience myself, just to see how many great people there are out there. We hear a lot of negative stuff about farming and nature all the time, and we have a lot of questions about how do we resolve our climate and biodiversity crises, but I've heard nothing but solutions over the last 3 or 4 months, and it's really inspiring. And they're not just theoretical solutions, they're practical solutions being carried out day in, day out by people on the ground. So brilliant work, Mimi, and all the ambassadors who are here with us tonight. I think many of them are here. So thanks so much, and thanks to everybody who's signed in and helped us with these events. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone. We'll see you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you.